The forgotten trail. In the remote wilderness where civilization is but a distant memory, a group of friends embarks on what they believe will be a challenging yet rewarding camping trip. Little do they know that their journey will lead them to a trail long forgotten by time. A trail shrouded in darkness and mystery. This is a story of survival. No fear in the unknown, as the group faces horrors beyond their imagination. The events that unfold will test their sanity and force them to confront the ancient evils that lurk within the depths of the forest. Prepare to be drawn into a tale where the line between reality and nightmare blurs, and every step deeper into the woods leads closer to a terrifying truth that has been buried for centuries. The idea for the trip had been Jacob's. He was the adventurous type, always looking for the next thrill, the next mountain to climb, the next uncharted territory to explore. His friends, Mike, Sarah, and Emily, were less enthusiastic but had been swayed by Jacob's relentless excitement. A week in the wilderness, away from the pressures of their city lives, sounded like a good idea. They needed the break, and besides, it would be fun to unplug from the world for a while. They chose a remote area in the Pacific Northwest, a vast expanse of forest and mountains that stretched as far as the eye could see. It was known for its challenging terrain and breathtaking scenery. But there was something else about the place, something unspoken. The locals had warned them about certain trails that should be avoided, trails that were not on any map. They had laughed off the warnings, attributing them to superstitions and old wives' tales. Jacob, ever the thrill-seeker, was intrigued by these forbidden trails. He had done his research and found mention of an old trail, one that had been closed off for decades after a series of mysterious disappearances. The authorities had never found any trace of the missing hikers, and the trail was officially marked as unsafe. But Jacob was undeterred. He was certain they could handle whatever the trail threw at them. They set out on a crisp autumn morning, the air cool and fresh with the scent of pine. The sun filtered through the trees, casting dappled light on the forest floor. The trail was well marked at first, and they made good progress. And the forest was alive with the sounds of nature. Birds chirping, leaves rustling in the breeze, the distant murmur of a stream. It was peaceful, almost idyllic. But as they ventured deeper into the woods, the atmosphere began to change. The trees grew taller and denser, blocking out the sunlight. The air became colder, and the forest grew eerily quiet. The once well-trodden path began to narrow, the underbrush growing thicker as if trying to conceal the trail. They pushed on, driven by a mixture of determination and stubbornness. By late afternoon, they reached a fork in the trail. The main path continued ahead, but there was another, narrower path to the right, barely visible beneath the overgrowth. Jacob stopped, looking at the faint trail with a glint in his eye. "This must be it," he said, his voice filled with excitement. "The forgotten trail." Mike frowned. "Are you sure this is a good idea? We don't know what's down there." "That's the point," Jacob replied. "We're here to explore, right? What's the fun in sticking to the beaten path?" Sarah and Emily exchanged uneasy glances, but they knew Jacob well enough to know that once he had his mind set on something, there was no changing it. Reluctantly, they agreed to follow him. The narrow path was difficult to navigate, overgrown with thorny bushes and low-hanging branches. The air grew colder still, and a thick fog began to settle in, making it hard to see more than a few feet ahead. Trees loomed like silent sentinels, their twisted branches reaching out like skeletal hands. As they ventured deeper, an unsettling feeling began to take hold. The forest felt wrong, unnatural. The sounds of wildlife had faded away, replaced by an oppressive silence. Even the wind seemed to have died, leaving the forest eerily sense as if they had stepped into another world, a world where the rules of nature no longer applied. They pressed on, though with each step their unease grew. The trail was barely visible now, more of a suggestion than a path. The fog thickened, swirling around them like a living thing. Shadows flitted at the edges of their vision, disappearing when they tried to focus on them. "Maybe we should turn back," Emily suggested, her voice trembling slightly. "This doesn't—" Jacob hesitated, looking around at the impenetrable fog. He was stubborn, but even he couldn't deny that the atmosphere had changed. There was something about this place that felt malevolent. "Let's just see what's up ahead," he said. trying to sound confident. If it gets too bad, we'll turn back. They continued, though, with less enthusiasm than before. The trail became steeper, leading them down into a deep ravine. The trees here were ancient, their gnarled roots breaking through the ground like the bones of some long-dead creature. The fog was so thick now that they could barely see each other, and they had to stay close to avoid getting separated. Suddenly, the ground beneath Emily's feet gave way, and she let out a cry as she tumbled down a steep embankment. The others rushed to her side, their hearts pounding. "Emily, are you okay?" Sarah called out, her voice echoing eerily in the fog. There was a moment of silence, then a faint reply. I think so." They carefully made their way down the slope to where Emily had landed. She was shaken but unharmed, though her ankle was twisted. As they helped her to her feet, they noticed something strange. The fog had cleared slightly, revealing a small clearing at the bottom of the ravine. In the center of the clearing stood an old, weathered cabin, half hidden by the undergrowth. It looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. The wood darkened with age, the windows broken and covered in grime. "What is this place?" Mike asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Jacob's eyes gleamed with excitement. "This is exactly what I was hoping to find. An abandoned cabin in the middle of nowhere. This is amazing." But the others didn't share his enthusiasm. There was something about the cabin that felt wrong, as if it were a place where terrible things had happened. The air around it was thick with a sense of dread, and the silence was oppressive. "We should leave," Sarah said, her voice shaking. "This place gives me the creeps." Jacob ignored her, already moving toward the cabin. The others had no choice but to follow, though every instinct screamed at them to turn back. The door creaked ominously as Jacob pushed it open, revealing the dark interior. The cabin was small, just a single room with a dirt floor and a fireplace in one corner. Old, rotting furniture was scattered around, covered in dust and cobwebs. The air was musty, and the walls were covered in strange symbols, carved into the wood with something sharp. "What do you think these mean?" Jacob asked, running his fingers over the carvings. "Probably some kind of warning," Mike muttered. "We should go. This place is giving me the creeps." But Jacob wasn't listening. He was too fascinated by the strange markings, the eerie atmosphere of the cabin. He pulled out his camera and started taking pictures, oblivious to the growing unease of his friends. Suddenly, Emily let out a gasp, clutching at her chest. "Did you guys hear that?" They all fell silent, straining to hear. At first, there was nothing, just the sound of their own breathing. But then, faintly, they heard it. A soft, whispering voice, coming from somewhere deep within the cabin. "Did you hear that?" Emily repeated, her voice trembling. It sounded like someone whispering. "Probably just the wind," Jacob said dismissively, though there was a hint of uncertainty in his voice. But the others weren't so sure. The whispering continued, growing louder, though they couldn't make out any words. It was like the cabin itself was alive, murmuring secrets they weren't meant to hear. "I don't like this," Sarah said, backing away toward the door. "We need to get out of here." But as they turned to leave, the door slammed shut with a loud bang, as if pushed by an unseen force. Panic set in, and they rushed to open it, but the door wouldn't budge. It was as if it had been sealed shut by something on the other side. "Jacob, what the hell is going on?" Mike demanded, his voice rising in panic. I don't know," Jacob stammered, his bravado gone. He pulled at the door with all his strength, but it wouldn't move. The whispering grew louder, more insistent, filling the room with an otherworldly sound. The temperature dropped suddenly, and their breath became visible in the freezing air. The cabin seemed to close in on them, the walls pressing closer, the symbols on the walls glowing faintly in the dim light, and then the whispering stopped. The silence that followed was even more terrifying. Thick with anticipation, they stood frozen, hearts pounding, waiting for something, anything to happen. Suddenly the fireplace roared to life, flames leaping up the chimney as if fed by an unseen hand. The light cast eerie shadows on the walls, and the room was filled with the acrid smell of burning wood. But there was no wood in the fireplace, no fuel to feed the flames. Then they saw it. In the flickering light, a figure appeared in the corner of the room, barely visible at first, like a shadow that had come to life. It was tall and thin, with elongated limbs and hollow eyes that glowed with a sickly green light. The figure moved toward them, its movements slow and deliberate, as if savoring the terror it was. The group backed away, pressing themselves against the wall, but there was nowhere to go. The figure continued to advance, its gaze fixed on them, its mouth opening to reveal sharp, jagged teeth. What do you want?" Jacob asked, his voice barely a whisper. The figure didn't respond, but the whispering started again, louder this time, filling the room with a cacophony of voices. It was as if the walls themselves were speaking, each symbol on the wood coming to life, their meanings lost in the mists of time. The figure reached out a skeletal hand, pointing directly at Jacob. The whispering intensified, the voices overlapping, each one trying to be heard over the others. The temperature dropped even further, the cold seeping into their bones. "Jacob, we have to get out of here," Mike shouted, pulling at the door with renewed desperation. But the door remained stubbornly shut, as if held in place by some unseen force. The figure moved closer, its hollow eyes glowing brighter, and the whispering voices seemed to converge into a single word, repeated over and over. "Leave." The word echoed in their minds, filling them with a sense of dread. They had to leave. But there was no way out. The walls seemed to close in on them, the cabin itself becoming a living entity, trapping them within. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the whispering stopped. The figure vanished, dissolving into the shadows as if it had never been there. The fire in the fireplace died down, leaving the room in darkness. The door creaked open slowly, as if releasing them from its grasp. They didn't need any more encouragement. Without a word, they rushed out of the cabin, stumbling over the uneven ground as they fled back up the ravine. The fog was still thick, but they didn't care. They ran as fast as they could, driven by sheer terror, not daring to look back. The forest seemed to close in around them. The trees twisted and gnarled, reaching out like skeletal hands to grab at them. Finally, they burst out of the fog and onto the main trail. The sun was setting, casting long shadows over the forest, but they didn't stop running until they reached their campsite. They collapsed on the ground, gasping for breath, their hearts pounding in their chests. For a long moment, they just sat there too shaken to speak. What the hell was that?" Mike finally asked, his voice trembling. "I don't know," Jacob replied, his face pale. "But we're not staying here. We need to leave." No one argued. They quickly packed up their gear, their hands shaking with fear. The sun had set by the time they were ready to leave, the forest now shrouded in darkness. They set off down the trail, their flashlights barely cutting through the thick gloom. Every sound made them jump, every shadow seemed to hide something sinister. But they didn't stop, didn't rest, driven by a single, overwhelming need to get as far away from that cabin as possible. Hours later, they emerged from the forest, stumbling onto the road where their car was parked. They piled in, and Jacob drove like a man possessed, not stopping until they reached the safety of the nearest town. They never spoke of the cabin again, each of them trying to forget the horrors they had witnessed. But the memories lingered, haunting their dreams, a constant reminder of the terror they had faced. And somewhere deep in the forest, the cabin still stands, waiting for the next unwary traveler to stumble upon its forgotten trail. The whispers are still there, carried on the wind, echoing through the trees, a warning to those who dare to venture too far off the beaten path. But the forest has a way of keeping its secrets, and the forgotten trail remains, hidden from those who would seek it out. For some things are better left forgotten, and some paths should never be walked again. The forgotten path. I never imagined that a weekend getaway with friends could turn into a nightmare. But that's exactly what happened during a trip to the suburbs of San Diego with my two best friends, Emma and Jake. What started as a simple escape from college stress quickly transformed into an ordeal that tested our sanity and left us questioning everything we thought we knew about reality. Here's our story. It all began with Emma's enthusiasm for finding an off-the-beaten-path destination. She stumbled upon an old, secluded cabin listed on a travel site. The reviews were sparse, but the idea of a remote retreat in the San Diego suburbs seemed perfect. Jake and I were hesitant, but Emma's excitement was contagious. and we decided to go along with her plan. We arrived at the cabin on a Friday afternoon. The place was quaint, nestled at the edge of a dense forest. The cabin was made of dark timber, with a steep roof and a stone chimney that seemed to curl smoke like a cauldron. The surrounding forest was thick and untamed, with twisted trees and tangled undergrowth. Despite the picturesque setting, there was something unsettling about the place, an almost palpable sense of abandonment. After settling in, we decided to explore the forest. The path leading into the woods was narrow and winding, obscured by dense foliage. The air was thick with the earthy smell of damp soil and decaying leaves. Emma led the way, her enthusiasm undiminished by the eerie atmosphere. Jake and I followed, our apprehension growing with each step. The deeper we went, the more the forest seemed to envelop us. The canopy of trees overhead grew denser, blocking out most of the daylight. Strange, shadowy shapes flickered in the periphery of our vision. But when we turned to look, there was nothing there. We stumbled upon an old stone structure, half buried under layers of vines and moss. It looked like it might have been a small, forgotten chapel, but its origins were unclear. Emma was fascinated by the structure and insisted we explore it. Inside, we found remnants of a bygone era, broken pews, a crumbling altar, and faded murals on the walls. The air inside was cool and musty, and there was a faint smell of decay. As we examined the interior, I noticed a strange inscription carved into one of the wooden beams. "Beware the path not taken." The words sent a shiver down my spine, but I kept my fears to myself. Emma and Jake were too absorbed in their exploration to notice. We spent the rest of the afternoon in the forest, but as dusk approached, a sense of unease settled over us. The forest seemed to grow darker, the shadows more menacing. Back at the cabin, the atmosphere was heavy. The sun had set, and the only light came from the flickering fire in the hearth. We decided to have dinner and talk about our plans for the next day, but the conversation was stilted. The eerie feeling from the forest lingered, and none of us could shake the sense that we were being watched. As night fell, strange things began to happen. The cabin creaked and groaned, as if the forest itself was trying to enter. The wind howled outside, and the shadows cast by the firelight seemed to dance on the walls, forming sinister shapes. We tried to laugh it off, but the unease was palpable. I woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of whispering voices. The cabin was silent, but the whispers continued, coming from outside. I tried to ignore it, but the voices grew louder, more insistent. I woke Emma and Jake, and we decided to investigate. We stepped outside, and the forest was shrouded in an unnatural fog. The whispers seemed to come from every direction, their source impossible to pinpoint. We followed the sound, our flashlights cutting through the fog, but the forest seemed to shift, and chain paths we had walked earlier appeared different, and the trees seemed to close in on us. We stumbled upon a small clearing, where the fog was thinner. In the center of the clearing stood an old, weathered stone pillar covered in strange runes. The pillar seemed out of place, its presence both ancient and foreboding. As we approached, the whispers grew louder, forming fragmented phrases that we couldn't quite understand. Suddenly the whispers stopped, replaced by an eerie silence. We turned to leave, but the fog thickened, and we found ourselves disoriented. The forest seemed to have changed completely, with familiar landmarks now unrecognizable. Panic set in as we realized we were lost. After what felt like hours of wandering, we finally found our way back to the cabin. The fog had lifted, but the sense of dread remained. We were exhausted and shaken, but we tried to get some rest. The next morning, we decided to cut our trip short. We packed our things and left the cabin, but the strange events of the previous night lingered in our minds. As we drove away, I glanced back at the forest. The trees seemed to watch us, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. We never spoke of that night again. The experience left us with more questions than answers, and we never returned to that cabin. The forest remains a haunting memory, a reminder of the forgotten path and the dark secrets that lie hidden in the shadows. And this day I still hear those whispers in the quiet moments, a chilling reminder of the night we ventured too far into the unknown. What we encountered in the San Diego suburbs remains a mystery, but the memory of that haunted path and the eerie feeling it left behind will stay with me forever. Alex's find that changed everything. Whispering Shadows. This story is about a young man named Alex, who stumbled upon something terrifying deep within the woods. A discovery that would forever alter the course of his life. It all began as an innocent hike, an attempt to escape the stresses of his daily routine. But what he found in the dense, shadowy forest was far from ordinary. This is a tale of fear, of a growing paranoia that slowly consumed him, and of a mysterious force that seemed to have been waiting for him all along. What Alex encountered in that forgotten corner of the world defies explanation, but it is something he can never forget no matter how hard he tries. It was a warm, lazy Saturday afternoon when I decided to head out for a hike. The small town where I lived was surrounded by forests, and I often ventured into them to clear my mind. That day, I chose a path I hadn't explored before, one that led deeper into the woods than I usually dared to go. The sun filtered through the leaves, casting dappled shadows on the forest floor, and the air was thick with the scent of pine and earth. As I walked, the trail became less defined, and soon I was moving through untamed underbrush. The deeper I went, the quieter the forest became, as if the trees themselves were holding their breath. A sense of unease began to creep over me, but I brushed it aside, telling myself that it was just the unfamiliar surroundings. After what felt like hours of wandering, I stumbled upon a small clearing. In the center of the clearing stood an old gnarled tree, its twisted branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. Something about the tree drew me in, and I felt an inexplicable urge to approach it. As I got closer, I noticed something strange, a small weathered box half buried among the roots. I hesitated for a moment, but curiosity got the better of me. Kneeling down, I carefully dug the box out from the earth. It was old, much older than anything I had seen before, with intricate carvings on its surface that seemed to depict some sort of ancient ritual. My heart pounded in my chest as I slowly opened the lid. Inside, I found a collection of items: an old tattered journal, a rusted key, and a small, delicate-looking object wrapped in cloth. The journal was filled with pages upon pages of faded writing, recounting the experiences of a man who had lived in the area decades ago. He wrote of strange occurrences, of shadows that moved on their own, and of whispers that seemed to come from nowhere. As I read, I felt a cold chill run down my spine. The man had described finding the very same box I was holding, and how his life had taken a dark turn after that day. He wrote of nightmares that plagued him, of an overwhelming sense of dread that followed him wherever he went, and of a growing paranoia that eventually drove him to the brink of madness. I wanted to put the journal down, to leave the box and everything inside it right there in the clearing, but something compelled me to keep reading. The last entry in the journal was barely legible, the handwriting frantic and shaky. The man wrote of a presence that had been following him, something he couldn't see but could feel watching him. He spoke of voices that whispered his name, of shadows that crept closer and closer until they were all around him. And then the entry stopped. I closed the journal, my hands trembling. The forest around me seemed to have grown darker, the trees closing in, and the air was thick with an oppressive silence. I quickly wrapped the items back in the cloth and shoved them into my backpack, desperate to leave that place. But as I turned to leave the clearing, I felt it. A presence, just as the man had described. It was as if the shadows themselves were alive, watching me, waiting for me to make a move. I could feel my heart pounding in my ears as I hurried back the way I had come. The forest now a twisted labyrinth of shadows and fear. The journey back to my car was a blur of panic and confusion. I stumbled and tripped over roots and rocks, my breath coming in ragged gasps as I fought the urge to look back. I didn't need to look. I knew something was behind me, following me. When I finally reached my car, I jumped inside and slammed the door shut, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get the key into the ignition. The engine roared to life and I sped out of the woods, not daring to slow down until I was safely back in town. For days after that, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The shadows in my apartment seemed darker, the nights colder, and the whispers in the silence grew louder. I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination, that the fear in the journal had gotten to me. But deep down I knew the truth. Whatever I had found in that forest had followed me home. And then the nightmares began. They were vivid, terrifying visions of the forest, of the old tree, and of the shadows that had surrounded me. I would wake up in a cold sweat, my heart racing, convinced that something was in the room with me. I stopped sleeping, too afraid of what I might see in the darkness. The days passed in a haze of exhaustion and fear. I couldn't focus on work, couldn't hold a conversation without my mind drifting back to that clearing in the woods. I started avoiding people, convinced that they could see the fear in my eyes, that they knew something was wrong. And then, one night, I heard it. The whisper. It was faint at first, barely more than a breath, but it was enough to send a chill down my spine. I froze, my ears straining to catch the sound. It came again, this time clearer, unmistakable. It was my name, spoken in a voice that wasn't my own. I tried to ignore it, to convince myself that I was hearing things, but the whispering continued, growing more persistent, more insistent. It followed me everywhere. At home, at work, even in broad daylight. It was always there, just out of sight, just out of reach, taunting me, driving me to the edge of insanity. Desperate for answers, I turned back to the journal. I read and reread every entry, searching for some clue, some explanation for what was happening to me. The man who had written it had been driven to madness, consumed by the same fear, the same whispers. He had become a recluse, shutting himself off from the world in a vain attempt to escape whatever was happening. But there was no escape. The last entry in the journal spoke of the man's final descent into madness, of how he had come to accept his fate, how the shadows had finally claimed him. He had written of a ritual, an offering that had to be made to appease whatever force was haunting him. But the details were vague, and the journal ended abruptly, leaving me with more questions than answers. The whispers grew louder, more demanding, until they were all I could hear. I couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, couldn't think. My life had become a waking nightmare, a never-ending cycle of fear and despair. I knew I had to do something. Anything to make it stop. I decided to return to the forest, to the clearing where it had all begun. Maybe if I returned the box, if I undid whatever I had done, the whispers would stop. Maybe I could finally find peace. The hike back to the clearing was even more terrifying than the first time. The forest seemed darker, more sinister, and the presence that had been following me felt stronger, more tangible. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig sent my heart racing, and I found myself glancing over my shoulder every few seconds, convinced that something was right behind me. When I finally reached the clearing, I was trembling with fear. The old tree stood in the center, its twisted branches reaching out as if to welcome me. I knelt down and carefully placed the box back among the roots, hoping that it would be enough to end the nightmare. But as I turned to leave, I heard it again, the whisper. It was louder now, more insistent, and it seemed to be coming from all around me. I felt a cold hand on my shoulder and I spun around, but there was nothing there. The shadows were closing in, suffocating me, and I realized with a sickening dread that there was no escape. I ran, my heart pounding in my chest, my breath coming in ragged gasps. But no matter how fast I ran, the shadows were always right behind me, growing closer and closer with each passing moment. I could feel their cold breath on my neck, their fingers brushing against my skin, and I knew that they were toying with me, drawing out the fear, savoring it. But as I turned to leave, the whispers grew louder, surrounding me, pressing in from all sides. It wasn't just one voice anymore. It was a cacophony of murmurs, each one more insistent than the last. My heart pounded in my chest as I realized the voices were coming from the box. The shadows around me seemed to shift and twist, closing in like a tightening noose. I was trapped. I tried to run, but my legs felt like lead. Each step was an effort, as if the forest itself was trying to hold me back. The ground beneath me felt unstable, almost like it was alive, pulsing with a dark energy that radiated from the box. Panic surged through me as I forced myself to move, stumbling through the underbrush, desperate to escape the clearing and the suffocating presence that filled it. When I finally broke through the tree line, and reached my car, I was drenched in sweat, my body trembling with exhaustion and fear. I didn't dare look back as I drove away. The image of that cursed clearing and the ancient box burned into my mind. But even as I sped down the deserted road, the whispers echoed in my ears, and I knew deep down that this was far from over. For days, I tried to go about my life as usual, but the experience in the forest had left a deep scar on my psyche. The whispers followed me everywhere, growing louder at night when I was alone. They seemed to be calling me, beckoning me back to the woods, and no matter how hard I tried to ignore them, they gnawed at my sanity. I couldn't concentrate at work. My colleagues noticed the dark circles under my eyes, the way I jumped at the slightest noise, but I brushed off their concerns with forced smiles and half-hearted excuses. I was too afraid to tell them the truth, that something was following me, something I couldn't explain or escape. The nightmares returned with a vengeance. Each night, I found myself back in the forest, standing before the twisted tree in the clearing. The shadows circled me, whispering in a language I couldn't understand, their voices full of malice. I would wake up, drenched in sweat, gasping for air, the sound of those whispers still ringing in my ears. It wasn't long before I started to hear the whispers even during the day. They were faint at first, just on the edge of hearing, but they grew louder and more insistent with each passing day. They whispered my name, taunted me, filled my head with dark thoughts. I tried to drown them out with music, with the noise of the city, but nothing worked. They were always there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the moment when I was most vulnerable. I became paranoid, convinced that I was being watched. I started avoiding dark corners and empty streets, refusing to be alone for too long. The shadows in my apartment seemed to move of their own accord, stretching and twisting in ways that defied logic. I knew it was the presence I had awakened in the forest, growing stronger with each passing day, feeding off my fear. One evening, as I sat in my living room with the lights on full blast, trying to distract myself with mindless television, I heard a loud thud from the hallway. My heart leaped into my throat. The sound wasn't just a creak of the old building. It was deliberate, heavy, as if something had fallen or been thrown. I stood up slowly, my body tense, every nerve on edge. The air in the room felt heavy, oppressive, as if it was thickening around me. I stepped into the hallway, the wooden floorboards creaking underfoot, and saw the door to my bedroom slightly ajar. My breath caught in my throat as I approached it, the whispers growing louder, more urgent. With a trembling hand, I pushed the door open. The room was dark, the shadows deep and impenetrable despite the light from the hallway spilling in. My heart pounded as I reached for the light switch, my fingers brushing against the wall. But before I could turn it on, the door slammed shut behind me with a force that shook the walls. I was plunged into darkness. The whispers rose to a deafening crescendo, swirling around me, filling my head with their sinister intent. I stumbled back, groping for the door handle, but it was gone, as if the door had never been there. The room seemed to stretch, the walls pulling away from me, the shadows growing and consuming everything in their path. And then I saw it. The box, it was there, sitting in the middle of the room exactly as I had left it in the forest. My blood ran cold. How had it gotten here? My mind raced, trying to make sense of the impossible, but there was no logic, no reason to cling to. The box was here, and with it came the presence I had been trying so desperately to escape. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and the shadows began to take shape, forming dark figures that loomed over me, their eyes glowing with an unnatural light. They reached out for me, their cold fingers brushing against my skin, sending jolts of icy terror through my body. I wanted to scream, to run, but my voice was trapped in my throat, and my legs refused to move. The figures closed in, their whispers filling my mind with a madness I couldn't escape. They were everywhere, surrounding me, suffocating me with their presence. I could feel their hatred, their hunger, and I knew that they wanted to consume me, to drag me into the darkness with them. Just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, the whispers suddenly stopped. The shadows froze in place, the room eerily silent. For a moment I thought it was over, that I had somehow survived whatever nightmare had been unleashed upon me. But then, the silence was broken by a single, clear voice. You cannot escape." The words were spoken in a voice that wasn't human, a voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It was cold, emotionless, and filled with a terrifying certainty. I felt a chill run down my spine as the room around me began to change. The walls twisted and warped, the ceiling melting away to reveal a vast, endless darkness above. I was no longer in my apartment. I was back in the forest, was standing before the old tree in the clearing. The box was at my feet, and the shadows had returned, circling me like vultures waiting to feast on a dying animal. I could feel the presence again, stronger than ever, watching me, waiting for me to make a move. The voice spoke again, this time louder, more insistent. "You belong to us now." Here, the ground beneath me began to tremble, the earth cracking and shifting as something massive stirred beneath the surface. The shadows closed in, their whispers returning, filling my head with their dark thoughts, their insidious promises. I could feel my sanity slipping away, the edges of my mind fraying under the relentless assault. And then, with a deafening roar, the ground split open. I was thrown back, landing hard on the ground as a massive chasm opened up before me. From the darkness below, something began to rise. A figure tall and thin, its body shrouded in shadow, its eyes glowing with an unnatural light. It was the presence that had been haunting me, the entity that had followed me from the forest, that had driven the man in the journal to madness. It was ancient, powerful, and filled with a malice that defied comprehension. I could feel its gaze upon me, its thoughts pressing against my mind, probing, searching. "You took what was not yours," the voice said, echoing in the vast emptiness around us. "Now you must pay the price." I tried to speak, to plead for my life, but no words came. I was frozen, paralyzed by fear, as the figure began to move toward me. Its steps were slow, deliberate, each one sending ripples through the ground as it approached. As it drew closer, I felt a coldness seep into my bones, a deep, penetrating chill that numbed my body and mind. The figure reached out, its hand stretching toward me, and I knew that if it touched me, I would be lost forever, consumed by the darkness that surrounded it. But just as its fingers brushed against my skin, a bright light suddenly filled the clearing. The figure recoiled, hissing in anger as the light grew brighter, pushing back the shadows, illuminating the forest in a blinding glow. I shielded my eyes, squinting against the brightness, and saw a figure standing in the center of the light. It was a man dressed in old-fashioned clothes, his face weathered and lined with age. He held a lantern in one hand, its flame burning with an otherworldly intensity. The man looked at me, his eyes filled with a sadness that I couldn't comprehend. "You shouldn't have come here," he said, his voice soft but firm. "This place is cursed. The shadows, they feed on fear, on darkness. They consume those who stray too far into their domain." I tried to speak, to ask who he was, but he shook his head, silencing me with a gesture. "There's no time for that. You need to leave this place now before it's too late." The light from the lantern flared, and the shadows screamed in pain, retreating into the darkness. The ground beneath me began to solidify, the chasm closing as the figure of the presence was pushed back into the earth. The man turned to me, his expression grim. "Go before they return. This forest is no place for the living." Without another word, he turned and began to walk away, the light of the lantern growing dimmer with each step. I hesitated for a moment, my mind racing with questions, but the fear of the shadows returning spurred me into action. I turned and ran, my heart pounding in my chest as I fled the clearing, the sound of the man's voice and the light of the lantern fading into the distance. I didn't stop running until I was back in my car, my breath coming in ragged gasps as I slammed the door shut and fumbled with the keys. The engine roared to life, and I sped away from the forest, the events of the night a blur of fear, and 4 days after, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was still being watched, that the presence was still with me, lurking just out of sight. The whispers had stopped, but the fear remained, a constant reminder of what I had seen, what I had unleashed. I tried to find out more about the man with the lantern, but there were no records, no mention of anyone matching his description. It was as if he had never existed, a ghost from the past, a fleeting memory that was already fading from my mind. But the box, I could never forget the box. I had left it in the clearing, but its image haunted my dreams, a symbol of the darkness that still lingered in the shadows of my mind. I knew that as long as it remained in the forest, the presence would continue to feed, to grow stronger, waiting for the next unfortunate soul to stumble upon its cursed domain. And so I made a decision. I would return to the forest, one last time, to destroy the box, to end the curse once and for all. I didn't know if it would work, if I would even survive the attempt, but I had to try. I couldn't live with the fear, the guilt, the knowledge that I had unleashed something so terrible into the world. The night I returned to the forest was darker than any before. The moon was hidden behind thick clouds, and the air was heavy with the scent of rain. I made my way through the woods, the path familiar but no less treacherous. The shadows seemed to move around me, but this time I wasn't afraid. I was determined, resolute. When I reached the clearing, the box was there, just as I had left it, sitting at the base of the twisted tree. The presence was waiting too, its form barely visible in the darkness, but I could feel its eyes on me, its malevolent gaze watching my every move. I didn't hesitate. I pulled a can of gasoline from my backpack and poured it over the box, the liquid soaking into the wood, the scent filling the air. The presence hissed, the shadows writhing in response, but I ignored them, striking a match and holding it over the box. For a moment, everything was still. The shadows stopped moving, the presence seemed to hold its breath, and the forest was eerily silent. Then I dropped the match. The flames roared to life, consuming the box in an instant. The presence screamed, a sound that reverberated through the clearing, shaking the ground, the trees, the very air around me. The shadows fled, retreating into the depths of the forest as the fire burned brighter, hotter, reducing the box to ash. I watched as the flames died down, the presence's screams fading into the distance. The clearing was silent once more, the twisted tree standing alone, its branches blackened by the fire. The box was gone, nothing but a pile of smoldering ashes left behind. I waited for a long time, half expecting the shadows to return, the presence to rise from the ashes, but nothing happened. The forest was still peaceful, almost as if the curse had been lifted, the darkness banished from its depths. I turned and left the clearing, my steps slow, deliberate. The fear that had gripped me for so long was gone, replaced by a sense of calm, of closure. I had faced the darkness, confronted the presence, and won. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, I felt free. But as I walked back to my car, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching me. Something deep in the shadows, waiting, biding its time. The fear was gone, but the memory remained, a reminder of the darkness that still lingered in the corners of the world, waiting for the next person to stumble upon it. And I knew deep down that the presence wasn't truly gone. It had been weakened, banished, but not destroyed. It would return someday, somehow, and when it did, it would be stronger, more dangerous than ever before. As I drove away from the forest for the last time, I couldn't help but wonder if anyone would believe my story, if anyone would listen to the warnings I had to offer. But I knew the truth didn't matter. The darkness was real. The presence was real, and it was only a matter of time before it found its way back into the world. And when it did, I could only hope that the next person to face it would be stronger than I had been, more prepared, more willing to do what had to be done. Because the darkness never truly dies. It only waits, lurking in the shadows, biding its time until it can strike again. I will never return to that forest, never set foot in those cursed woods again. But the memory will stay with me forever, a scar that will never fade, a reminder of the price I paid for my curiosity. The whispers may have stopped, but the silence is even worse. Because now I know what's out there waiting, watching, and I know that someday, somehow, it will find me again. And when it does, there will be no escape. The Forgotten Trail. This is the story of a camping trip I took with a few friends into the heart of a remote forest that none of us had explored before. What started as an adventure quickly turned into a nightmare when we stumbled upon an old, forgotten trail that led us deeper into the woods than we ever intended to go. As we ventured further, Strange things began to happen. By the time we realized what was really going on, it was too late. This is my account of that fateful trip, a story I've never told anyone until now. I had always considered myself an experienced outdoorsman. I'd been on countless hikes, camping trips, and even a few solo treks through some of the most remote wilderness areas in the country. So when my friends suggested we take a week-long camping trip to explore a forest that none of us had been to before, I was all in. Me, Paul, Jenny, Derek, and Sophie. We'd all met in college and had kept in touch over the years through our shared love of the outdoors. This trip was supposed to be our big reunion, a chance to reconnect and unwind away from the stress of our everyday lives. Paul had heard about the forest from a coworker, a place so remote that it was rarely visited by anyone other than the occasional hunter or forest ranger. It was a dense, sprawling woodland with no marked trails and only a few dirt roads that led in and out. The perfect place to get lost in nature, Paul said. I should have taken that as a warning. We packed up our gear, loaded it into Paul's old Savane, set out early one morning in late September. The drive took most of the day, the scenery gradually changing from rolling hills and farmland to thick, towering trees that seemed to swallow up the sunlight. By the time we reached the edge of the forest, the sun was dipping low on the horizon, casting long shadows across the landscape. We'd park the SUV at the edge of the forest, hike in for a few hours, set up camp, and spend the next few days exploring the area. We had maps, compasses, and GPS devices, so we weren't too worried about getting lost. But as we ventured deeper into the forest, it became clear that this place was different from anywhere we'd been before. The trees were enormous, their branches intertwining overhead to form a dense canopy that blocked out most of the sunlight. The air was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth, and the forest floor was covered in a thick layer of moss and fallen leaves that muffled our footsteps. There were no sounds of civilization, no distant hum of cars, no planes overhead, just the occasional rustle of leaves and the call of a bird somewhere high above. It was beautiful, in a wild and untamed way, but there was also something unsettling about it. The deeper we went, the more I felt like we were being watched. I didn't say anything to the others, chalking it up to my imagination, but the feeling persisted. After a few hours of hiking, we found a small clearing near a stream and decided to set up camp. We pitched our tents, gathered some firewood, and settled in for the night. As the sun set and the forest grew darker, the feeling of unease only grew stronger. The woods around us seemed to come alive with strange noises, rustling leaves, snapping twigs, and the occasional low moan that seemed to come from deep within the trees. We tried to brush it off, telling ourselves it was just the normal sounds of the forest at night, but I could tell that the others were starting to feel it too. The conversation around the campfire was quieter than usual, and there were more than a few nervous glances toward the dark trees surrounding us. By the time we turned in for the night, I was on edge. I lay in my tent, listening to the sounds of the forest, every creak and groan of the trees sending a shiver down my spine. Sleep didn't come easily, and when it finally did, it was filled with strange, unsettling dreams of being lost in the woods, unable to find my way out. The next morning, we all woke up feeling a little out of sorts. None of us had slept well, and there was a tension in the air that hadn't been there before. But we tried to shake it off, telling ourselves that it was just the unfamiliar surroundings getting to us. We decided to spend the day exploring the area around our campsite, following the stream deeper into the forest. The trees grew even thicker as we went, their trunks gnarled and twisted, covered in moss and lichen, and the underbrush was dense, making progress slow and difficult. As we pushed on, we came across an old, overgrown trail that seemed to lead further into the forest. It was barely visible, more of a faint indentation in the ground than an actual path, but it was there. Paul, always the adventurous one, suggested we follow it and see where it led. I was hesitant. There was something about that trail that didn't sit right with me. It felt wrong somehow, like it hadn't been walked in years, maybe even decades. But Paul was insistent, and the others were curious, so I reluctantly agreed. We followed the trail for what felt like hours, the forest growing darker and more oppressive with each step. The trees seemed to close in around us, their branches forming a tangled web overhead that blocked out the sky. The air was thick and still, heavy with the scent of decay. The further we went, the more I started to notice strange things. Small, almost imperceptible details that set my nerves on edge. The trees here were different, their bark darker, almost black, and their leaves a deep, sickly green. The underbrush was thicker, the ground littered with dead leaves and rotting wood. And there were no sounds of wildlife, no birds, no insects, nothing. Just the sound of our own footsteps and the occasional snap of a twig underfoot. Eventually, we came to a small clearing, the trail ending abruptly at the edge of a large, stagnant pond. The water was dark and murky, covered in a thick layer of algae. The air around it was heavy with the smell of rot, and the ground was soft and spongy underfoot. There was something deeply unsettling about that place. The air was thick with a sense of foreboding, and the silence was oppressive. I felt an overwhelming urge to turn back, to leave that place and never look back. But before I could say anything, Paul spoke up. "Looks like this is the end of the trail," he said, his voice sounding unnaturally loud in the stillness. I couldn't agree more. The others nodded, and we quickly turned to leave. But as we started to make our way back, something strange happened. The trail, which had been so clear before, seemed to vanish. The trees all looked the same, and the underbrush was so thick that it was impossible to tell which way we had come. So panic set in. We tried to retrace our steps, but no matter which direction we went, we couldn't find the trail. The forest around us seemed to shift and change, the trees twisting and turning in ways that made no sense. The underbrush was so dense that it felt like we were wading through quicksand, every step an effort. And then we started hearing the whispers. Faint at first, just on the edge of hearing, but growing louder and more insistent with each passing moment. It was like the forest itself was alive, watching us, mocking us as we struggled to find our way out. The whispers grew louder, more distinct until they were all around us, a cacophony of voices speaking in a language none of us could understand. They seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, echoing through the trees and making it impossible to tell where they were coming from. We were lost, completely and utterly lost. The forest had swallowed us whole, and no matter how hard we tried, we couldn't find our way out. The whispers were relentless, driving us to the brink of madness as we stumbled through the trees, desperately searching for a way back to camp. As the hours passed, the forest grew darker, the trees closing in around us, their branches reaching out like skeletal hands. The air was thick and suffocating, the whispers growing louder and more frenzied with each step. And then, just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, we stumbled upon something that made my blood run cold. In the middle of the forest, hidden among the trees, was an old, dilapidated cabin. It looked like it had been abandoned for years, the wood rotting, the windows broken, and the roof caved in. There was something deeply wrong about that cabin. It didn't belong there, didn't belong anywhere. The air around it was thick with a sense of malevolence, and the whispers grew louder as we approached, as if the forest itself was trying to warn us away. But we were desperate. We had no idea where we were or how to get back, and the cabin seemed like our only option. Paul, always the fearless one, was the first to approach it, pushing open the creaking door and stepping inside. The rest of us followed, our footsteps echoing in the empty, decaying space. The interior of the cabin was just as unsettling as the outside. The floor was covered in dirt and debris, and the walls were lined with strange symbols, carved deep into the wood. There was a heavy, oppressive feeling in the air, like the weight of something ancient and evil lingered within those walls. I hesitated at the threshold, every instinct screaming at me to turn back, to leave that place and never look back. But the others were already inside, and the thought of being alone in the forest was even more terrifying. I took a deep breath and stepped over the threshold, the door creaking shut behind me with an ominous finality. The cabin was small, just one room with a dirt floor and a sagging roof. The only light came from the dim, gray daylight filtering through the broken windows. The air was thick with the smell of rot and decay, and the walls were covered in strange symbols. Spirals, circles, and lines that seemed to shift and change when I looked at them. "What do you think this place is?" Jenny asked, her voice barely above a whisper, as she ran her fingers over one of the symbols on the wall. Some kind of ritual site. Derek suggested, though he didn't sound convinced. Those symbols, they look like something out of a horror movie. They're definitely not random, Sophie added, her eyes wide as she examined the walls. Someone put them here for a reason. Let's not stick around to find out why, I said, my voice trembling despite my efforts to stay calm. We need to get out of here and find our way back to camp. But as soon as I said it, I realized how hopeless that idea was. We had no idea where we were, and the forest outside was a maze of identical trees and dense underbrush. The whispers were still there, just beyond the walls of the cabin, growing louder and more insistent with each passing moment. Paul, who had been silent since we entered the cabin, finally spoke up. "We should stay here for the night," he said, his voice unnaturally calm. "It's getting dark, and it'll be safer than trying to find our way back in the dark." I wanted to argue, to insist that we keep moving, but I knew he was right. The thought of wandering through the forest in the dark, with those whispers all around us, was more than I could bear. Reluctantly, I nodded, and the others did the same. We set up our sleeping bags on the dirt floor, trying to make ourselves as comfortable as possible in the oppressive atmosphere of the cabin. But no matter how much we tried to relax, the feeling of unease never left, and the walls seemed to close in around us, the symbols shifting and writhing in the dim light. As the night wore on, the whispers grew louder, filling the cabin with a low guttural sound that made my skin crawl. It was like a chorus of voices, all speaking at once in a language I couldn't understand. I could feel them in my mind, probing, searching, like they were trying to find a way in. I tried to block them out, pulling my sleeping bag tighter around me and closing my eyes, but sleep wouldn't come. Every time I started to drift off, I would jerk awake, heart pounding, the whispers still echoing in my ears. At some point, I must have dozed off, because the next thing I remember is waking up to complete silence. The whispers were gone, the air in the cabin still and heavy. I sat up, my heart racing, trying to figure out what had woken me. And then I heard it, a soft, scratching sound coming from the corner of the cabin. I froze, my breath catching in my throat, as the sound grew louder, more insistent. It was like something was clawing at the walls, trying to get in. "Do you hear that?" Sophie whispered from her sleeping bag, her voice trembling. "Yeah," I whispered back, my eyes fixed on the dark corner where the sound was coming from. Paul, who had been sleeping nearest to the corner, sat up slowly, his eyes wide with fear. "What the hell is that?" Before any of us could answer, the scratching stopped. The silence that followed was even more terrifying, the air thick with tension. We sat there in the dark, listening, waiting for something to happen. And then, the door to the cabin creaked open slowly, as if pushed by an invisible hand. A cold gust of wind blew through the cabin, carrying with it the scent of decay. The whispers returned, louder than ever, filling the cabin with their incomprehensible chorus. Paul grabbed his flashlight and shone it towards the door, but the beam seemed to be swallowed by the darkness outside. "We need to get out of here," he said, his voice trembling. I didn't need to be told twice. I scrambled out of my sleeping bag and grabbed my backpack, slinging it over my shoulder. The others did the same, their movements frantic as we rushed towards the door. But as we stepped outside, we were met with a sight that made my blood run cold. The forest was different, twisted, warped, like something out of a nightmare. The trees were no longer just trees. Their branches reached out like gnarled hands, their bark covered in the same strange symbols that had lined the walls of the cabin. The ground was uneven, the path we had taken earlier completely gone. The whispers were all around us, louder than ever, as if the forest itself was alive, watching us, waiting for us to make a move. "We need to stick together," Derek said, his voice shaking. "We can't get separated." We huddled close, our flashlights barely cutting through the thick darkness. The air was cold, biting, and every step felt like we were walking through molasses. The whispers grew louder, more urgent, like they were trying to drive us mad. As we stumbled through the forest, the trees seemed to shift and move, blocking our path at every turn. It was like the forest was alive, trying to keep us trapped within its twisted embrace. At some point, We realized we were walking in circles. No matter which direction we turned, we kept ending up back at the same spot. A small clearing with a dead tree in the center, its branches twisted and blackened. The sight of that tree filled me with a sense of dread so deep, I could hardly breathe. "This isn't right," Jenny whispered, her voice trembling. "We're never going to get out of here." "Don't say that," Paul snapped, his voice tense. "We'll find a way out. We just need." But I knew he didn't believe his own words. The fear in his eyes was unmistakable. We were lost, completely and utterly lost. The forest had trapped us, and there was no way out. Hours passed, or maybe it was minutes. It was impossible to tell. Time seemed to have no meaning in that place. We were exhausted, our movements sluggish, but the fear kept us going. The whispers never stopped, growing louder and more insistent with each passing moment. And then out of nowhere, we stumbled upon something that made my blood run cold. A second cabin, identical to the first, hidden deep within the twisted trees. It was like a mirror image of the one we had left behind, down to the last detail. "This can't be happening," Sophie whispered, her eyes wide with terror. We left this place, but there was no denying what we were seeing. The cabin was there, solid and real, its door slightly ajar, just like the first time we had found it. The whispers seemed to converge around it, growing louder and more frenzied as we approached. "We can't go in there," I said, my voice shaking. "We need to find another way." But the forest around us seemed to close in, the trees pressing closer, their branches blocking any path that didn't lead to the cabin. It was like we had no choice. The only way forward was through that cursed cabin. With no other options, we reluctantly made our way inside. The interior was the same as before. Dark, decayed, the walls lined with those strange shifting symbols. The air was thick with the smell of rot, and the whispers were so loud now that they drowned out everything else. We huddled together in the center of the room, the oppressive atmosphere pressing down on us. It felt like the cabin was alive, watching us, waiting for something. The whispers were all around us, inside us, filling our minds with their strange, incomprehensible language. And then the door slammed shut, the sound echoing through the cabin like a gunshot. The whispers reached a fever pitch, a chorus of voices that seemed to pierce through my skull, driving me to the brink of madness. I couldn't take it anymore. I screamed, covering my ears, trying to block out the sound. The others were doing the same, their faces twisted in terror. It felt like we were being torn apart, our minds unraveling under the relentless assault of the whispers. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. The whispers faded, the air growing still and silent. I opened my eyes, my heart pounding in my chest, and what I saw made my blood run cold. The cabin was gone. We were no longer inside that decaying structure, but standing in the middle of the forest, surrounded by the same twisted trees and dark, oppressive atmosphere. The symbols were gone, the whispers silent, but the fear remained, a cold, gnawing terror that I couldn't shake. "We're never getting out of here," Sophie whispered, her voice trembling. "We're trapped." But before I could respond, something caught my eye. A faint light in the distance, barely visible through the trees. It was small, flickering like a campfire or lantern. Without thinking, I started towards it, the others following close behind. The light was our only hope, the only sign of life in that dark, twisted forest. We pushed through the underbrush, our hearts pounding, desperate to reach it. As we got closer, the light grew brighter, revealing the source. A small, flickering lantern hanging from a tree branch. Below it, a figure stood, barely visible in the dim light. It was an old man, his face hidden in shadow, his clothes ragged and dirty. He was muttering to himself, his voice low and unintelligible, but there was something about him that made my skin crawl. His presence felt wrong, like he didn't belong there, like he wasn't even human. "Who are you?" Paul called out, his voice shaking. The old man looked up, his eyes glowing in the dim light. His face was gaunt, hollow, his skin stretched tight over his bones. He smiled, a twisted, unnatural smile that sent a shiver down my spine. "You're lost," he said, his voice raspy and cold. "The forest has claimed you." "What do you mean?" Derek asked, his voice trembling. The old man chuckled, a low sinister, a sound that made my blood run cold. You've stumbled upon something you shouldn't have. This forest, it's alive. It's been watching you, waiting for you to make a mistake. And now you're trapped. We just want to leave, Jenny said, her voice desperate. Please, can you help us? The old man shook his head slowly. There's no leaving this place. The forest has chosen you. You'll wander these woods forever. Just like the others. I asked, my heart pounding. What do you mean? But the old man didn't answer. Instead, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the darkness of the forest, his lantern flickering and fading until it was gone. We were left standing there, alone in the dark, the weight of his words hanging over us like a death sentence. There was no way out. We were trapped, lost in a forest that was alive, watching us, waiting for us to make another mistake. Desperation took hold, and we started running, crashing through the underbrush, not caring where we were going as long as it was away from that place. The forest seemed to close in around us, the trees twisting and turning, blocking our path at every turn. The whispers returned, louder and more frenzied, filling our minds with their incomprehensible language. It was like the forest itself was mocking us, driving us to the brink of madness. And then, just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, we stumbled upon something that made my heart stop. It was the cabin. The same cabin we had found twice before, standing there in the middle of the forest, its door slightly ajar. But this time something was different. The air was thick with the scent of decay, and the ground around the cabin was littered with bones. Human bones, picked clean and bleached white by the elements. The realization hit me like a ton of bricks. We weren't the first to stumble upon this cursed place, and we wouldn't be the last. The forest had claimed others before us, and now it was our turn. There was no escape. We were trapped, doomed to wander those twisted woods until we met the same fate as the others. The whispers grew louder, their voices filled with malicious glee, as if they were celebrating our impending doom. And as we stood there, paralyzed with fear, the door to the cabin creaked open, and something stepped out. Something that had once been human but was now twisted and deformed, its skin pale and translucent, its eyes glowing with an unnatural. It was the old man, or what was left of him. His body was gaunt, skeletal, his skin stretched tight over his bones. He smiled at us, a twisted, malevolent smile that sent a shiver down my spine. "You're too late," he said, his voice a raspy whisper. "The forest has claimed you." And then he lunged at us, his hands outstretched, his eyes glowing with a terrifying light. We turned and ran, our hearts pounding, the whispers echoing in our ears as we fled into the darkness. But no matter how fast we ran, we couldn't escape the feeling that the forest was closing in around us, the trees reaching out with twisted branches to drag us back into the nightmare. The whispers grew louder, more frenzied, filling our minds with their incomprehensible language, driving us to the brink of madness. We were lost, completely and utterly lost, with no way out. The forest had claimed us, and there was nothing we could do to escape its grasp. We ran until we could run no more, collapsing to the ground, our bodies exhausted. As I lay there, my breath ragged, my heart pounding, I realized that we were never going to leave this place. The forest had won. We were its prisoners, doomed to wander those twisted woods for eternity, just like the others before us. And as the darkness closed in around us, the whispers returned, louder and more insistent, filling our minds with their terrible, incomprehensible language. There was no escape. We were trapped, lost in a nightmare that would never end. That's the last thing I remember, before everything went black. When I woke up, I was alone, lying in the middle of the forest, the sun just beginning to rise. The others were gone, and the forest was silent. No whispers, no movement, just an eerie, oppressive stillness. I tried to find them, calling out their names, but there was no answer. It was like they had vanished, swallowed up by the forest. I wandered for hours, maybe even days, trying to find my way out. But no matter which direction I went, I always ended up back at that same clearing with the dead tree. Eventually, I gave up, too exhausted and broken to keep going. I found my way back to the cabin. or what was left of it. The walls had collapsed, the roof caved in. The symbols on the walls faded and worn. It was like the forest had swallowed it up, erasing all traces of what had happened there. I don't know how long I stayed there, just sitting in the ruins of that cabin, waiting for something, anything, to happen, but nothing did. The forest was silent. Eventually, I found my way out, or maybe the forest let me go. I don't know. I just know that one day I stumbled out of the trees and onto a dirt road. A passing car found me disheveled and half-crazed and took me to the nearest town. No one believed my story, of course. They said I must have gotten lost, that the others had probably found their way out and were looking for me. But I know the truth. I know what happened in that forest. I never saw Paul, Jenny, Derek, or Sophie again. It was like they had vanished off the face of the earth, swallowed up by that cursed forest. And sometimes, in the dead of night, I still hear the whispers, faint and distant, calling to me, reminding me of what I lost in that dark, twisted place. I've never been back to that forest, and I never will. But I know it's still out there, waiting, watching, ready to claim the next unfortunate souls who stumble upon its forgotten trail. And I know that one day, the whispers will come for me too, and when they do, I'll be ready,